Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good, and let your
Shalom Aleichem, Spirit and Truth Seekers, lovers of Yeshua the Messiah, and lovers of His Torah. Welcome to another edition of Waters in the Wilderness, a teaching ministry of Hoshana Rabbah Biblical Discipleship Resources, as we continue our journey through the Torah. And it is our joy and our privilege to teach the Torah in a way that is hopefully relevant and applicable to your daily lives, and also as it relates to the message of the gospel, with Yeshua the Messiah being the focal point of the gospel message. Today we will continue in Leviticus, actually start in Leviticus 25, and the name of this Torah portion is Torah portion or Parashat Behar, starting in Leviticus 25, going roughly for one chapter through Leviticus 26 verse 2. Actually, it's two chapters. So anyway, I encourage you to go to our website, our ministry website at hoshanarabbah.org, and there, if you click on the Torah Studies tab at the top of the page, you can download our free study guides that I have written and published, and they are ideal for individual study as well as group, family, group, and congregational study. Many this has been used in many ways, in this way by many around the world, and they are free. They can be downloaded in PDF format, and that will give you kind of an overview of that particular chapter with questions and answers and scriptures to look up. It's very interactive and subjects to discuss and that kind of thing. What we are going through today, much of this is not included in that Torah study, and some of it is, but a lot of it is fresh material, and I'm constantly studying the Torah, studying the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and coming up with new information because I am an inquisitive kind of a person, and I studied to be a journalist. The reason I wanted to be a journalist, and I was a journalist for a short period of time, but the reason I did is because I was curious and I wanted to know about the world around me. Well, in the last number of decades, I have focused that curiosity specifically to the area of the Bible, because I do believe it is the Word of Elohim, and it is the path of salvation, the path of truth. It is the contains truth, the truth which comes from Elohim, divinely inspired truth. And I have a desire to serve and obey Elohim, to follow Yeshua the Messiah. And I want to know everything I possibly can, to not only know with my head, but with my heart as well. So anyway, I'm privileged to be able to share some of what I've learned over the years of study with you, and hopefully you will be blessed. So today we're going to start in Leviticus 25. And I'm not going to read this section, but I'm going to talk about, or read this entire chapter, but we're going to talk about the first few verses. Basically, it's almost the whole chapter. I'm going to actually turn there. So I'm actually looking at it here in my own Bible. And it's it talks about, basically it's the biblical social welfare system. Starts talking about the Sabbath, the sabbatical year, the seventh year, the year of Jubilee, and provisions for the seventh year, and then redemption of poverty and lending to the poor. So the Bible, the Torah talks about being your brother's keeper, and it combines, as we're about to see, it definitely promotes a free enterprise capitalistic system, but there are aspects of socialism in there, where as far as taking care of the needy and this kind of thing. So anyway, but it's not at all like the systems we see going on in the world today, where Big Brother and big government is involved in basically taking money out of people's pockets and then redistributing the wealth. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. So Leviticus 25 in part lays out Israel's social welfare and economic system. Basically, that system in ancient Israel was a free market capitalistic system where private individuals owned property and small businesses, and they controlled the means and production of goods and services. And the central government's involvement in the lives of people was minimal. This is not in any case. This is not the case in a purely socialistic or Marxist or communistic economic system like we have on the earth today in various places, and has gone on in the 20th century and into the 21st century, where the government owns much or most of the property and controls to one degree or another the means and distribution of goods and services, and where the government regulations of people's lives is tremendous. Even in the United States, the land of the free, the home of the brave, if you look over the last 117 years or so, certainly over the last, since World War I, even before that, government encroachment, government expansion, government control, government regulation, government's involvements in people's lives down at the most personal level, what they can and can't do with their homes, their property, their businesses, has grown exponentially. It used to be back over 100 years ago that the government was not really involved in people's lives. Maybe when you were born, you received a birth certificate, and when you died, you received a death certificate, and that was pretty much it. There weren't even any taxes that were on income, individual income. Now the government is involved in every aspect of your life, and you all know that. And for those that are not students of history, you think it's always been this way. But for those of us that have lived a little bit longer, or are students of history, we realize that is not the case. Government keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it requires more control, more. It places more demands on people's lives, and of course, to support that financially, the taxes keep going up. When the graduated income tax came into the United States in about 1913, the tax rate was very low. In fact, it was only on the super wealthy. Now the tax rate is tremendous on everybody, and we pay all kinds of taxes at all levels, from local to state to federal. And I'm sure that if the New World Order could have its way, it would also levy a tax on us that would be going to the United Nations or whatever global governmental system will be in place at the time. So in the United States, the federal government owns most of the land as well. Go look at the Bureau of Land Management and the National Forest Service and these kind of agencies, and most of the land in the United States is owned. And if you do own your land, you have to pay the property taxes to your local county. If you don't, they will repossess your land. You're not free to do what you want with your land if you live in a city or a county or anywhere. All kinds of regulations and restrictions, and some of them are good, but many of them are very, very difficult and onerous to live under. So the capitalistic system that Yehovah gave to Israel, however, contained some quasi-socialistic checks and balances, in that greedy or even exceptionally gifted and ambitious individuals couldn't become excessively rich at the expense of the poor. We see that going on in our socialistic or our capitalistic societies, and I'm not going to go into that too much. We could talk about that, where you have these mega corporations that are basically in bed with the government and the banking interests and so forth that control people's lives, and the 1% of the, I just read a statistic just in the last few days that 1% of the wealthy of the world control 50% of the wealth of the world. 1% of the super rich control 50% of the global wealth. That is insane, and that would not be allowed to exist under the Torah. And we'll explain how that would operate here momentarily. Socialistic economic philosophy demands that the wealth of the nation be equally distributed among everyone, including the poor. This may sound good in theory, but it doesn't work. In reality, socialism stifles individual initiative by punishing, often through taxation and other means of wealth confiscation and redistribution by the government. It confiscates wealth from those who, through hard work and sacrifice, initiative and inventiveness, have become wealthy. So it stands to reason, why should the wealthy work hard if the fruits of their labors will only be confiscated and be given to the poor or the have-nots or those who refuse to work? So socialism largely stifles incentive and the desire on the part of hardworking people to want to work hard, because it'll just get taken away from them. Some people will point to certain nations in Europe where socialism seems to be working. But I like to point out what Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, once said. She says, socialism works until the money that capitalism previously made runs out, and then socialism fails to work. Now everybody's poor, and the economic systems begin to collapse. And that's exactly what we see going on in Europe. That's what we have seen go on in every socialistic or Marxist country. Socialism is a road to Marxism, to totalitarianism. It's a gradual progression. And if you don't believe that, then I hate to say it, but you're naive and ignorant of history and of the people that are behind the scenes trying to control that path. That is what they have stated. That's what Marx stated in his Communist Manifesto, which I have read and studied. So, you can believe what you want, but socialism is called gradualism, or some of the British economists in the early to mid 1900s came up with the idea of Fabian socialism, where they wanted to have a more collectivistic society, but they knew it wouldn't happen overnight through the overthrow of the elite, the bourgeoisie, as Marx called it, where the workers overthrow the government and overthrow the middle class, those that own the businesses and the property. And so they knew that wouldn't happen overnight, like what happened in the French Revolution. It was a bloodbath, or in the Communist Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution, or the Cuban Revolution, or any other place where there have been communists that have quickly taken over through the barrel of a gun, as Mao Zedong, the communist revolutionary in China, said, that justice and power comes through the barrel of a gun. And that's exactly what they believe. The ends justify the means. So this is what socialism ultimately leads to. It leads to a bankrupt society. So once a society becomes has through hard work has become capital, through free enterprise and freedom, has developed a wealthy middle class of people that have worked hard to build up what they have, and build up businesses and all of that. Once the social, and they build up wealth as a result of hard work and inventiveness and incentive. And once socialism comes in, and that incentive and wealth is now supposedly transferred to the have-nots, well, suddenly once that wealth is gone, now the economics, socialism doesn't do a very good job of producing wealth. It uses and consumes wealth, but it doesn't produce wealth. And that's what we have going on in some of the Scandinavian countries and elsewhere in Europe, where they were wealthy before, but now several decades of socialism are leaving them basically high and dry financially, and now they're moving into debt and having all kinds of social problems, and the government can't sustain or support the social welfare system that has now grown to become, again, too big and too large to fail. And so governments have to bail these things out, and now governments go further and further into debt, and the currencies are debased, and you have economic problems of one kind or the other. And that's basically what we face in the West and also around the world. Now, at the same time, capitalism is also a flawed system. We want to be objective here. Capitalism, in its pure, unrestrained form, is a flawed system, since in time the wealthy often end up owning much more much of the land and control most of the wealth. Human nature being what it is, the greedy wealthy will turn a capitalistic system into an oligarchic system where only a few rich capitalists control nearly everything, including the economic and political systems. So monopoly is where one person controls, let's say, an entire industry. But an oligarchic system, or an oligarchy, is a system where several wealthy corporations control, let's say, all the communications, all the media, all the entertainment, all the banks, whatever, all the oil companies. And basically that's what we pretty much have going on today. This is the end time system as described in Revelation 13 and chapters 13 and 18, and is called Babylon the Great, or Mystery Babylon. I call it the Babylon the Great New World Order system. Such a system ends up enslaving people through economic and political means, thus creating a veritable feudalistic type serfdom where rich and powerful business oligarchs who control the government are now the new nobility. And you find that described in Revelation 18 verses 13 and 23. It says the rich men, the merchants, and the rich people are the ones that control the earth, is what it says there in Revelation 18. With these things in mind, as you are reading through chapter 25 of Leviticus, notice how Jehovah instructed the poor to be cared for. There was no government welfare system like we have today. In fact, the Torah commands everyone to work for 6 days and then to rest on the seventh day. That's the Sabbath command, the fourth commandment, which we find in Exodus 20, verse 9. So everybody was commanded to work. Sloth and laziness were not options. Even the extremely impoverished were expected to harvest food from the agricultural fields. At the same time, those who owned the fields were to leave the corners of their fields unharvested and to not glean their fields, so the poor would have something to harvest. And we read that in Leviticus, that command in Leviticus 23, verse 22, and also the whole book of Ruth. That little book talks about that. Ruth was very poor, and she was able to go into Boaz's field and glean to support her and her mother-in-law, Naomi. Now, in the testimony of Yeshua, or the New Testament, fathers were expected to provide for their households. Those who didn't were considered worse than heathens or infidels. 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. So whoever claims to be a saint or a believer, if they did not provide for their house, they were worse than a heathen, according to Paul's instructions to Timothy. Similarly, widows under the age of 60 were expected to support themselves through their own work, while those over the age of 60 could be supported by the local church, but they had to recompense the church for their service, or through acts of service. And we read that in 1 Timothy 5, 9 through 14. Once again, the Bible in no way allows for or promotes a system of government handouts or a welfare system. Now, when I was growing up, it was called welfare. Now it's called entitlements, as if you don't want to work, you're entitled to government handouts. That is psychosis. That is sick. That simply engenders laziness and slothfulness among people. If they think that they don't have to work and the government will give them money. That's absolutely contrary to the Bible, where everybody is commanded to work for 6 days, who is able-bodied, able to do so. Once again, the Bible in no way allows for or promotes a system of government handouts. Because the government only gets its money from you and from me, those of us that do work. And they get it through legalized extortion called taxation. They basically steal the money out of your pocket or out of my pocket and give it to somebody who refuses to work. And this is contrary to the Bible. Except in rare situations where people are physically unable or too old or just have some sort of a handicap, everyone in the Bible was expected to work. In this chapter, Leviticus chapter 25, we also see how the Bible handles the issue of debt and how it requires people to work to pay off their debts. Bankruptcy was an option. The Torah allows those in debt to sell themselves into servitude to their debtors, and through a system called bond service. The debtor would work for the lender until the debts were paid, and at the end of 7 years, all remaining unpaid debts had to be forgiven. It was a very merciful system. It held the person who got into debt responsible for his own actions, but at the same time, it was a situation where he paid back what he could, and after 7 years, if there was something still that he owed that he couldn't pay back, he wasn't in that kind of servitude or bondage for the rest of his life with that debt hanging over his head. The debt had to be forgiven by the debtor. So there was mercy and grace, and everybody had to give a little. That really is merciful. That's a merciful system. This system taught fiscal responsibility to debtors, yet at the same time it required lenders to show mercy and grace to the poor. Again, the Bible in no way promotes a system of government welfare handouts. Everyone had to work. If they didn't work, they didn't eat. That's what we read in 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10. If a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. I guarantee you, when you get hungry, you'll get out there and work. You'll find something to do. Only the extremely poor who were unable to make a living, such as widows and orphans, were cared for from the public coffers. And we read about that in the Torah prescribes that in Deuteronomy 14:28 through 29 and Deuteronomy 26:12 through 13. The Levites were cared for publicly as remuneration for caring for and teaching the people spiritually. The Levites also worked as farmers and tradesmen. So you didn't have career clergy. They all worked. I've been in the ministry for 27 years. 18 years of that I was a pastor at a local congregation. I still am in pastoral ministry, but I've never taken a living from the ministry. I've always worked hard. I own and operate a business, just like the Levites did. And it would be proper of me biblically, both in the Old and New Testaments, to take a living, to take a salary or a stipend or something for my hard work, generating teachings, doing videos, writing, all the things I've been doing for years, helping thousands and thousands of people. It would be very nice if people supported that hard work. And many people, thousands of people, watch these videos and read my stuff that my wife and I have done. We don't have a staff; we do it ourselves, and it would be nice if people supported us financially. But to be honest, just enough money comes in to pay the bills, to pay for equipment, to pay for internet, to pay for computers and that kind of thing. There's not any money left over to pay me a salary, so I do it for free. And I figure someday I'll reap it from my heavenly bank account, so to speak. I trust in Yah. Meanwhile, I have calluses on my hands, and I go out and make a living as a contractor. I own a tree care company, and I'm out working all the time. I've been doing that for about 40 years. So anyway, it's that's what we do. So that's the biblical welfare system that was in place and that is specified in Leviticus 25 and elsewhere. Now, Leviticus 25 also talks about the Jubilee Year that prevented the wealthy from acquiring all the land, and how every 50 years there was a redistribution of land or a redistribution of wealth, since people made their living from the land, so that those who through sloth, mismanagement of their resources, or through unfortunate circumstances lost their land, they could get their land back. Such individuals were mercifully given a second chance to start over again and to learn from their past mistakes. Lending to the poor was encouraged, and the charging of interest to them was prohibited. As you read through this chapter, consider how Yehovah deals with the perennial social and economic ills that have plagued the world from time immemorial, compared to how men currently deal with these same problems, and usually end up making matters worse. Though it would be difficult to implement such a social welfare system, if you want to call it that, In our highly collectivized, industrialized society of today, it is likely that in the future, during the millennium, when the Torah will be the rule of the earth, and an agrarian society will likely be the dominant economic paradigm, that such a Torah-based system will once again be put in place. Now let's talk a little bit more about the Land Sabbath and the Jubilee here in Leviticus 25, verse 2. We read in Leviticus 25, verse 2, it says, "When you come into the land which I give you," that's Yehovah speaking, "then the land shall keep a Sabbath to Yehovah. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to Yehovah. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord," and so forth and so on. So, we want to talk about this a little bit. Note that this is called a Sabbath rest for Yehovah. A Sabbath rest for Yehovah. The Jewish sages say that this does not imply that Yehovah rests. It acknowledges the fact that as Yehovah rested after his creation of the world, so too Israel was to rest in the 7th year from its agricultural work, an activity that allows the created, that is human, to share with the Creator in the act of creation and to commemorate Elohim's act of creation. The Jewish sages also note that the comparison between the Jubilee and the Sabbath is that both bear testimony to Elohim's creation of the universe in 6 days and his rest on the 7th day. They further note that the 7 years of the Shemitah is the 7-year sabbatical cycles, in Hebrew called the Shemitah, alludes to the 6,000 years of history that will be climaxed by the 7th millennium, which will be a period of peace and tranquility. Now we read that from the Art Scroll Stone Edition Chumash, page 697. So this has been Hebraic Jewish thought for many years, that man would be on the earth for 6,000 years, and then as man works for 6 days, he'll be on this earth for 6,000 years, and then the 7th day, which is the 7th day Sabbath, would also pictures the time when man would be on the earth for 1,000 years, and is called in the book of Revelation the millennium, which means 1,000 years. But this, in Jewish thought, going back to antiquity, is called the Messianic age, when Messiah would rule and reign. Note how everything ancient Israel did in their day-to-day life brought them into a worshipful relationship with their Creator by causing them to recall both what He had done for them in the past tense and what He would do for them prophetically in the future tense. So the seventh day Sabbath, as well as the 7-year Land Sabbath. So the farmer would till and cultivate his land for 6 years, and then he would rest on the 7th year and not cultivate his land. It all commemorates what Elohim did in the past, and also memorializes what He will do in the future during the Messianic age, or the millennium, when men will be resting for 1,000 years under the reign of Yeshua the Messiah. Now in Leviticus 25 verse 4, we read about the Land Sabbath, the Sabbath of rest unto the land. The Land Sabbath teaches us that our means of producing an income belong entirely to Yehovah. So again, a farmer would till his land for 6 years, and in the 7th year he would rest. He would just let his land grow fallow, and that would have a chance for the land to rest and to replenish itself, and a chance for the farmer to do other things during that time, but he wouldn't be farming his land. He gives, and this is a way of worshiping Yehovah and learning to have faith in and trust Him. Yehovah gives us life and breath and land and health and eyesight and physical and mental abilities and everything else that we need to survive. Now imagine losing, say, your health or your eyesight or your ability to function, or due to an illness. Suppose you through a stroke or an injury to the head, you became mentally impaired. Where would you be financially? Well, we belong to Yehovah, and He gives us everything we need with which to work our land, do our job, raise our family, educate ourselves, and to exist. Are we as grateful to Him as we should be? That's a question each of us really needs to ask ourselves. Now in Leviticus 29 verse 9, the Land Sabbath and the Jubilee go hand in hand. So there would be seven 7-year cycles. So seven, or you work 6 years and then you take the year off and rest. So the 6 plus 1 is 7, and there'd be 7 of those. 7 times 7 is 49. So you have 7 sevens, seven periods of 7 years, 7 periods of 7 years, and then multiplied, that comes out to be 49 years. And in the 50th year was the Jubilee year. We read about that in Leviticus 25 verse 9. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. That's on Yom Kippur. On the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, you shall make the sound of a trumpet to sound throughout your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. And the 50th year shall be a jubilee year. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of its own accord, and so forth and so on. Now this is very interesting because in American history, the Liberty Bell, which is at Independence Hall there in Philadelphia, where the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence and all of that, our government basically was formed at Independence Hall. I've been there, and when I was there many, many years ago, the Liberty Bell was actually out in the open with a little fence around it, and you could actually stick your finger in the crack of the Liberty Bell. I actually stuck my finger in the crack. But on the side of the Liberty Bell, and I read it with my own eyes, is this quotation from this verse: you shall proclaim liberty throughout all the land. That's why it's called the Liberty Bell. And it's this quote from Leviticus 25 verse 9. A beautiful little page out of American history to show what our biblical roots and the biblical foundations, the Torah foundations of our nation really are. Now you can't, my understanding is that they've got the Liberty Bell put away. You can still see it, but you can't touch it. Well, I actually got to touch it. And like I said, I stuck my finger in the crack of the Liberty Bell, which is kind of cool to be able to do. So this every 50th year, so there would be the Jubilee year, and they would have the 7th year of the 7th year time cycle would be a year rest. So in the 49th year, it would be the farmer would rest, but then in the 50th year, the farmer would rest also and not cultivate his crops and reap his crops. So that would mean for 2 years, he would not be able to reap and sow. I mean, you could eat the food that grew volunteer, but you couldn't harvest it, and I mean you could eat it, and but you couldn't harvest it or cultivate it like a crop and harvest it like a crop that you would normally do the other years. So for 2 years, he wasn't able to raise food. That is this kind of food that's stipulated on the land. It doesn't include fruit trees, but as far as grain crops and grapes and that kind of thing, vegetables, he wasn't able to raise those crops. Which means Yehovah promised that the farmer, if they served and obeyed and blessed him, or obeyed him, Yehovah Elohim, that is, Yah would bless the farmer the previous years, such that they would have so much left over that they would be carried through for 2 years in the 49th and 50th year, and actually then they would then would not reap until the 51st year. So basically, you've got 2 years there. Let's see, you got the 49th year, the 50th year, and into the first year of the next 50-year time cycle before they would reap. And so, because you got to plant your crops, and then it takes a while for them to fructify, to come to fruition, so they can be reaped. So that was quite an act of faith on the part of the farmer. But this is, that if he obeyed Yah, he would be blessed. And that's something that the Israelites never did, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They never had that kind of faith, and because of that, they went into captivity for 70 years. We'll talk about that momentarily. So, Leviticus 25, verse 9 talks about the Jubilee. The word Jubilee is the Hebrew word Yovel, meaning ram's horn trumpet. And I've got a ram's horn trumpet around here. I've got a bunch of them, actually. There's several. Well, this is my first shofar I ever bought years ago, back 22 years ago or so. This is a little ram's horn shofar. It's got a strap on it. I used to carry it. So here's what a ram's horn shofar sounds like, and this is what the word Yovel means. It means a ram's horn trumpet. Here's one that I made. Here, I'll blow this for you just so you can see what it sounds like. That's what that one sounds like. Now here's one I actually made. I found a ram's horn at a farm that bought it, and this is a little tiny one, a little guy. He's got a real high pitched sound. Okay, there's a ram's horn. Here's another ram's horn. Here's another one that I made. That's a black one. That's a ram's horn. And I'll show you a white one that I made. This is a good blower. Or is it? It's up here somewhere. Oh yeah, this one. This is a cutie. These are just different types of ram's horns. So this is another ram's horn that I personally made. I hollowed it out and made the piece, the mouthpiece, and then sanded it down so that it looks pretty. And so that's the ram's horn would be sounded. That's what the word Yovel means. And the ram's horn would be sounded at special events as a proclamation of great joy and jubilation, such as would be the case at the commencement of the Jubilee Year, when all debts were forgiven. Yeah, it was a time of great celebration. I mean, just imagine, you get this vacation for a couple of years and the debts are forgiven. You don't have to work out in the toiling in the hot sun, plowing your fields and harvesting your crops. All debts were forgiven, all indentured servants were set free, all land was returned to its original owners, and all agricultural activities ceased for a year of rest. The arrival of the Jubilee Year was announced on Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, with the blast of a shofar called the Shofar Hagadol, or the Great Shofar, or the Great or Final Shofar blast, and that's to be distinguished from the first and second shofar blast that occurred on the Feast of Shavuot, and then the second shofar blast, or the final one, occurred on Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets, respectively. And then the one that sounded at the Jubilee Year was called the Shofar Hagadol, the Great Shofar. So you had the shofar, the first shofar, which was sounded there when the children of Israel received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and then you had on the Day of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, which is in the fall. Then you'd have a lot of shofars sounding on that day, and you can go get a video, one of the videos I've made on that biblical feast, and learn about that. But that's the Day of Trumpets, or shofar blasts, and that The last one that sounded in the series of shofar blasts that occurred on that day was called the Day of Trumpets, or called the Last Trumpet. And that's when the resurrection of the dead will take place prophetically in the future at Yeshua's second coming. And then the great shofar blast will occur on Yom Kippur. Well, occurred on Yom Kippur. And I believe this same event prophetically corresponds with the return of the exiles, the lost 10 tribes, to the land of Israel, which is an aspect of what the Jewish sages call the final redemption and the return of Yeshua the Messiah. There's a whole lot there we could talk about, but we won't get into that. We've discussed the prophetic eschatological implications of this in other videos. Now, in Leviticus 25, verse 21, Yehovah promises that if the people obey him and keep his Land Sabbaths and keep his Jubilee rests, he says, and if you say, verse 20, what shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce? Then I will command my blessings on you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth produce enough for 3 years. And you shall sow in the 8th year and eat old produce until the 9th year, until its produce comes in, you shall eat of the old harvest. So, as I said earlier, in the 50th year, they would have to rest on the 49th year, which was a sabbatical year, and the 50th year, which is a Jubilee year, and then all the way into the first year of the next cycle, because it would take a while for the harvest to come in from that year. So basically they had between 2 and 3 years where they weren't bringing any fresh food. And Yehovah promised, if you obey me, I will bless you. I will bless you. Well, now it's an act of faith. And again, as we will see in a moment, the Israelites for 490 years never kept the Jubilees. And even the 7-year time cycle, where they rested on the 7th year. And Yehovah, because of that and other areas of disobedience, they went into captivity, and they went into for 70 years in Babylon. The Jews did, at least, because they did not keep 70 land Sabbaths for a total of almost 500 years, 490 years. So the Land Sabbath forced the Israelites to depend totally on Yehovah to bless them triplefold in the 6th year, so that they would have enough food to last the 7th year of that year's crops. That would have been on the Jubilee year. Now, in the Land Sabbath, the regular Land Sabbath, other than the Jubilee year, they had their produce had to last for 2 years. So they would keep the Land Sabbath on the 7th year, and then they would it would be sometime in the first year of the next 7-year time cycle that they would reap their new harvest. So they were without fresh food for going almost up to 2 years. But on the Jubilee year, it was 3 years, which is an incredible act of faith to trust Yehovah. That would be like me working for a year in my tree service and asking Yah to bless me such that I could take three years off and not work. I mean, to be honest with you, that would take some faith, and I don't have the finances to do that. But back in that age, that era, things were different financially, and Yah promised that He would take care of them. As an amazing act of faith on their part, which they never practiced. Observing the Land Sabbath was a major act of faith on the part of the farmer, who had to trust that Yehovah would bless his crop so abundantly that he could take a year or more off from farming. Though Israel was given Yehovah's laws concerning the Land Sabbaths, and though Yehovah provided his people with a glorious opportunity to demonstrate incredible faith in him by blessing them abundantly in the 6th year, and to see his miraculous provision, thereby strengthening their faith and thereby receiving even more blessing from Yehovah the next time, thus strengthening their faith to an even higher level, bringing the higher level and of more blessings. Israel never kept the land Sabbath for 490 years. Israel took the path of least resistance, like a lot of us do, which was not to trust Yehovah's word and his promises, but to trust in themselves and their own reasoning, to follow the dictates of their own carnal, greedy hearts. This led to the demise, the ultimate demise of their nation, and finally the captivity that lasted for the Jewish people for 70 years. 1 year for each of the 70 land Sabbaths they missed during that 490 years. So, the judgments of Elohim are sure. We disobey, we may not suffer the consequences immediately, but we will suffer them down the road, or the next generation will suffer them, or we will suffer them when we stand before the judgment seat of Elohim in that final day. So what is our point? All of Yehovah's laws, even the seemingly least important ones, are important and affect not only our lives, but those of future generations. For they set laws of cause and effect into motion that Yehovah has spiritually programmed into the universe. When we disobey Yehovah, even in the slightest area, we and our descendants will pay the price for our sins. In our modern godless economic system, observing the Jubilee isn't possible. On an individual basis, however, farmers can practice the Land Sabbath law as a way to care for the land and to show respect for and trust in the Creator of it. And I can tell you, I grew up on a farm, and my parents were Torah obedient, and we kept the land Sabbaths. We raised all of our own vegetables, and we would every 7 years we would let our ground go fallow. We usually plant a cover crop over the top of it that was rich, some sort of a legume, and that we would then let grow, and then we would till the legume into the soil as a green mulch, and that would help to put organic matter as well as nitrogen back into the soil, so we would help to build up the soil. And we had very rich soil, and our gardens, all vegetable gardens, always produced a lot of food. And we would can our food and preserve our food and dry it and freeze it, and we would always have plenty left over to rest on that seventh year. It was always a blessing for us. Now, Leviticus 25 verse 35 talks about your poor brother. What do you do when your brother is poor? Leviticus 25 verse 35. As I said earlier, there was a social system in place to help those who were genuinely poor, who through one reason or the other they fell into extreme poverty. They weren't able to work, or circumstances happened in their lives and they weren't able to support themselves. Verse 35 says, if one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your Elohim, and your brother, that he may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. I am Yehovah your Elohim, that brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your Elohim. So what Yehovah is teaching his people is here is like, you guys used to be slaves back in the land of Egypt. I delivered you, and I gave you all of this beautiful land, the land of promise, the promised land, the land of Canaan. And so I want you to remember your roots, where you came from. And if your brother is poor, I want you to remember that, look, the reason you have money is because, or you have land or wealth or food or whatever, is because I have blessed you. And that is true for all of us. We all have been blessed in one way or the other. So when somebody comes to us in genuine need, if it's in our ability to help them, and we can do so without depriving our own family of its provision or its sustenance, and jeopardizing our own financial well-being, then it is our duty to help our fellow man. What do you do to help the poor? Treating them fairly and helping them when it is in your power to do so is very important to Yehovah's spiritual economy. And I remember what James says in James 2:27, he says, pure and undefiled religion is this, to visit the fatherless and the poor in their affliction. If I'm quoting that correctly, let me double check that. But the bottom line here is that, look, our job is to help those in need. In fact, James says in another place, he says, faith without works is dead. If you say that you love your brother and you're not helping him, he's hungry and thirsty, and you say, hey, be blessed and be warmed and filled and go your way, but you don't help him and it's in your power to do so, then your faith is in vain. Your faith is meaningless. It's just words. It's just talk. You need to back up your faith with action. I said here, James 2:27. That's actually that's not the correct verse. I made a mistake there. It's a typo in my. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm not sure exactly where that is. I know it's in James. Maybe it's 1 verse 27. Yes, it's James 1:27. Pure and undefiled religion before you of all our fathers is to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So the widows and orphans were tended to be the poorest of the people in the midst, in your midst, and so it was a job of righteous Israelites to care for them. I'm going to make that correction right here. There we go. Now, let's talk about, again, another way to care for the poor was slavery, biblical style. Now, you say slavery in the Bible, oh my, and horror of horrors. Because when we think of slavery, we think of slavery in like the American Negroes back during the time of slavery, or other places where slavery is practiced. But this is not what biblical slavery was all about. It was more like indentured servanthood, or being an indentured slave. And let's talk about this a little bit. It says here in Leviticus 25, let's go back here. 25, starting in verse 2. And in our Bible, most of our Bibles that use the word slaves. And again, when we see the word slaves, we get all horrified. But we've got to look at the cultural context. And biblical slavery was very different than the slavery that we think of, where people were abused, mistreated, and treated basically like animals to one degree or another. It says here, if one of your brethren... Oh, hang on, let's move down a little bit further. It talks about the poor, taking care of them. And for they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, and they shall not be sold as slaves. So there was slavery. The children of Israel were slaves in Egypt. But he says you're not to enslave people such that they are bought and sold. You shall not rule over them with rigor, but you shall fear your Elohim. And for your male and female slaves whom you have from the nations of those around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And that you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession, they shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over them with rigor. So, there was, slavery was permitted, but it wasn't the kind of slavery that we had in American history, for example, or other nations like in the Caribbean, or in African nations, or in some Muslim countries, wherever slavery is practiced. The word slaves or bondmen is the Hebrew word ebed, E-B-E-D, meaning slave, servant, manservant, or even worshiper of Elohim. Servant of Elohim, such as the Levites and priests and prophets, were called ebed, or servants or slaves. Abed derives from the basic Hebrew root word abad, A-B-A-D, meaning to work or to serve. So basically these were workers. The word abad refers to service that can be directed toward people, things, or Elohim. In biblical usage, if directed toward things, abad can refer to tilling the earth, dressing a vineyard, working flax, or constructing a city. When abad is used in reference to tilling the earth and to serving Yehovah, it can refer to the Levitical and priestly service. In Hebraic thought, such service is considered joyous, not bondage. This same service can be directed toward pagan deities as well. When used in reference to serving another man, abad transforms into the noun ebed, meaning slave or servant. So the concept of Hebrew slavery isn't akin to the modern concept of slavery, where the slave possesses no basic human rights. This was not the case in ancient Israel. The Hebrew slave, on the other hand, occupied a position of status and involving rights and trust. The Torah required this to be the case, as this and other Torah passages demonstrate. And I'd like to say something else too. It says that you cannot enslave a fellow Hebrew. However, you can bring people in from other nations. You know, to be a slave in the land of Israel under the Israelites who were served Elohim and followed his Torah, was the people would have been these people from other nations would have been a lot better off than had they been in their heathen pagan nations where they worshipped idols, practiced witchcraft, sorcery, divination, were Satan worshippers, Baal worshippers. When they came into the land of Israel, they came under the blessing and the umbrella, the protection of Yehovah Elohim, where they would be able to learn the ways of Torah and eventually assimilate into the nation of Israel. It was a form of evangelism. They were to be treated with basic human rights. They were not to be, hurt and mistreated. And if you go and read this a little bit further, this is not an exhaustive treatment of the subject of biblical slavery, but basically it was a way to bring in people from other nations and little by little assimilate them into Hebrew culture, and eventually they would intermarry and become part of Israel. So, when you start thinking about that, this wasn't such a bad system to bring these people out of their heathen, pagan, godless cultures and societies and little by little introduce them into Hebraic Torah culture, and eventually then they would assimilate and be brought into that way of life. Leviticus 24:45 talks about buying and selling, and I think we might have already read that. It says, "Moreover, you may buy the children of the stranger who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, that they shall become your property, that you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over them." Anyway, so it goes on. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details. This is a much larger subject. We're just kind of throwing a stone over the water and dealing with the basics of this here. Now, let's talk about this. This passage advocates slavery among the Israelites. Yet this is, again, as I want to emphasize, this is not the slavery of for example, the American Negroes that experienced prior to the American Civil War. It must be remembered that slavery was rife in the ancient world. Often slaves, however, were able to own homes and livestock and to maintain families, as was the case with the Israelites in Egypt and the Jews in Babylon. So there's all different levels and kinds of slavery, even in the ancient world. In this case, these slaves were more like servants or feudal serfs. For example, in Israel, the Gibeonites who were Canaanites, became the slaves of Israel, but they continued to dwell in their own cities and enjoy Israel's military protection. Go read this in Joshua chapter 9. Also, it must be remembered that when Israel conquered an opponent's land or army, they often inherited slaves from those countries or slaves from other countries that the conquered country itself had enslaved. What were the Israelites to do with these people who had been dispossessed of their lands? Send them back to the countries that no longer existed or to which they were no longer welcome? Send them back into heathen situations? Instead, and we talked about this earlier, but I want to elucidate a little bit. Instead, you have allowed Israel to bring these captured people into Israel, where they could live among Torah-obedient people who worship the God of Israel. Yovah Elohim, where they would be taught to love Elohim totally and their neighbors as themselves. In time, these slaves would be assimilated into the tribes of Israel through intermarriage and become part of Israel, grafted into Israel, like the Gentiles, and thus be elevated in their social status. In this sense, slavery was a means of evangelizing those who found themselves in the lowest echelons of the ancient world. It was ostensibly a way to bring them into the ways of the Torah and thereby elevating them spiritually and socially from their previous enslaved heathen conditions. So, this was not such a bad thing as some people who have little or no knowledge of ancient cultures or of the Torah like to make this out to be. When you actually look at the details and you study what this is talking about, you realize this was a very civil way to deal with difficult situations that the Israelites might have found themselves having to deal with. Now, Leviticus 25, verse 55. This is the very last verse in this chapter. It says, "For the children of Israel are servants," or slaves. It's the word servants is the word abed there. "To me, they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am your Elohim." So the word servants there is again the word abed. And the point I want to make here is that here Yovah declares that the children of Israel are my slaves or servants, is the Hebrew word abed, whom I have taken out of the land of Egypt. I am Yovah your Elohim. Here Yovah states dogmatically that he brought or redeemed the Israelites out of the land of Egypt so that they could become his slaves. Does this trouble you? You think that you're a slave? Being a slave of Yovah didn't seem to trouble the apostles of Yeshua, who referred to themselves many times as Yovah's bondservants or slaves. The apostles did. Romans 1:1, Titus 1:1. Paul refers to himself as a bondservant or a slave of Yeshua. James 1:1. James referred to himself as such. 2 Peter 1:1. Peter refers to himself as that. Jude 1:1. Jude refers to himself as that. Revelation 1:1. John, the Revelator, refers to himself as that. Perhaps their view, the apostles' view of slavery, is different than ours. Did they not see two categories of slavery and that all humans fall into one or the other category? Look, the bottom line is either we're a slave to the world, the flesh, and the devil, and that leads to death ultimately, compared to slavery, I put that in quotes, to the word and the spirit of Yehovah, to Yeshua the Messiah, who bought and paid for each of us with his blood, redeemed us from death, hell, and the grave, from the world, the flesh, and the devil. And through his spirit and through his word, he leads us to life. There is no escape. One is either a slave to the law of sin and death that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 7 and 8, or he is a slave to a law of the spirit of life in Messiah Yeshua, Romans 8, 1 through 2. Those who have been redeemed by the blood of Yeshua have become Yeshua's purchased possessions, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 16, 19 and 20. Let me read that. What? Know you not that your body is the temple of the set-apart Spirit which is in you, which you have of Elohim, and you are not your own, for you are bought with a price. Therefore glorify Elohim in your body and in your spirit, which are Elohim's. So we do not belong to ourselves. That is the legal, spiritual reality of it, whether we want to recognize it or not. Either you are a slave and are belong to the world, the flesh, and the devil, ultimately to Satan, or you belong to Yeshua. You say, well, I don't want to be a slave to anybody. No, there's no gray area. You're either a slave to the world, the flesh, and devil, and ultimately to the devil, ultimately to the devil, or you are a slave to Yeshua. To deny your slavery or to pretend it doesn't exist does not change the reality of it. This is the reality that the Bible lays out. There are two paths, one that leads up, one that leads down. The path of light and the path of darkness. And those that are in this nebulous gray area, they unwittingly are on the path of darkness. It's just the bottom line. That's just how it is. That's the biblical reality of where people are at, whether they realize it or not. So do you love your life? Make choices. Do or don't do things. Say or don't say things every day with the reality that you are a slave to Yehovah. Is Yeshua truly your Lord and Master? It is easy to make the claims that he is, but living out the reality is totally a different thing. May we all be slaves and bondservants as the apostles were, as the disciples were, to Yeshua the Messiah, the one who loved us while we were yet sinners and gave his life, that we may have life in him and live eternally and never be victorious over death, hell, and the grave, through and more than conquerors through him. Hallelujah. If he be for us, who can be against us? Greater is he that is us than he that is in the world. And I'm more than a conqueror through Yeshua the Messiah. And I willingly give my life to him as a bondservant, because he offers us riches and eternity as his sons and daughters in his kingdom, if we will not only accept him as our Savior, but also as our Lord and Master. Hallelujah. May we all do that for his glory and for our blessing. Amen.
Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat.